To another episode of Witty CFB. Your host, Rob Sheply here. And on today's episode, we have Pete Lubar joining us from Final Play Sports Wrap out of Denver, Colorado. Pete, it's great for you to join us again. We were talked a little bit about UCF football a couple months ago, and it's great to hear your voice again and come on and join us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, can you give obviously I'm going to put your podcast and your show in the description here. Can you just give the audience just a little preview, a little flavor on what you do on your channel?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. It's called Final Play Sports Wrap. It's out on YouTube. And I focus on primarily the Big 12 and Mountain West football and basketball. So I spend all my time doing that and sports gambling when I'm thinking about it.
No, that's awesome. And it's funny because I was looking up Big 12 sports channels, and you just randomly came up on my feed, and I heard your content, and I instantly said to myself, hey, I got to have this guy on. And you're just so enthusiastic and knowledgeable, and it's always just really enjoyable to hear that. So hopefully people tuning in check it out.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're here to talk about Kansas State football, and at least to me, they're a pretty intriguing team for a number of reasons. They bring back a ton of talent this year, 71% returning production on offense and 63% defensively. And they just seem like a really well-rounded team. And one of those things where I think they certainly have some Big 12 title aspirations, and they definitely bring back some younger talent and a lot of guys who can probably develop and guys who can also contribute immediately. So with that said, Pete, how do you look at this Kansas State team, and what do you think the general expectations are going to be for them this year?
Well, they're going to be a good team. They were 9-4 last year, 5-4 in conference. Kind of lost some games that you wouldn't have thought they would have lost. They lost to Houston. That game probably shouldn't have been lost, but they've got an experienced coach. Got Chris Kleiman heading into his seventh year. He's been 48-28 at Kansas State. Before that, he won national championships at the FCS level with North Dakota State. He's 120-41 overall. They're going to be ranked in the top 25. I've seen them anywhere between 18 and 22, depending on who's rating them this early. So they're going to be a good team, and they've got a quarterback back, Avery Johnson, who really developed last year. I think he threw for 2,700 yards or something like that. And they had a really balanced offense. So I think they should expect to be contending for the title. I think they're going to be one of the better teams in the Big 12, and they should be expecting to potentially get to a national championship semifinal or final game, and we'll see where that goes, depending on how the Big 10 and SEC teams do.
Yeah, and we've talked about this off camera too multiple times. That's one of the best things about talking about Big 12 football is that it's so unpredictable in that way. In terms of last year, I thought we were talking about Oklahoma State and Utah being in that Big 12 race. So then everybody knows how that went too. And you brought up Avery Johnson a couple seconds ago, a kid that I'm really a huge fan of, and unsurprisingly, a number of bigger schools tried to go after him, such as Tennessee and a couple other SEC programs too. And, he was pretty vigilant in saying like, hey, I'm happy with Kansas State here. He is from Wichita, Kansas too. And just a homegrown town and somebody who's really kind of came into his own. So with that said, what exactly do you like about Avery Johnson, and how do you think his leadership's going to develop as well? Because I think that's one of my favorite things about him too, as well as having Matt Wells as new offensive coordinator, which I think is going to be a big deal.
Yeah, Matt Wells, former Texas Tech head coach, former Utah State head coach, coached at New Mexico, been around for a few years, but now Avery is in the second year in the program. And so last year he threw for 2,700 yards, 25 TDs, which is really good, and only 10 interceptions. I think he's going to take a next step. He's going to be more comfortable in the system. He lost some good receivers, but he's got some talent coming back. He's got a junior named Jace Brown, who established himself as a big-time Big 12 receiver last year with 47 catches, 823 yards. But Avery's also mobile, which is good. So he's not just sitting duck in the pocket. He's able to scramble and gain yards. And so I think that makes him a really dangerous guy. And certainly now he's a junior, as a team leader. I expect him. I wouldn't be surprised this year if he has 3,500 yards, maybe 20 to 25 to 30 touchdowns, and maybe gets a little more accurate and has only 8 interceptions for the year.
Yeah, because even when you look at his stats last year, I mean, you routed off a little bit of it, but 2,700 passing yards, 25 touchdowns, about 7 touchdowns on the ground. So he is certainly athletic and definitely a weapon that they're going to utilize in the red zone as well. And, I know you mentioned a couple seconds ago that you think he could potentially go for 3,500 yards or at least this year. So with that said, how do you imagine this Kansas State offense changing a little bit with some of these different weapons that they're bringing in? You can talk about, for example, Jace Brown. You can talk about Caleb Medford from New Mexico, and also J. Rand Bradley from Boston College and Texas Tech, who averaged about 14 yards per catch too.
Well, if anything, I think they're all going to be more comfortable in the program, and they're going to be able to run faster. And they kind of run that, shotgun pistol offense, a little up pace. You've got running back Dylan Edwards coming back. He is taking over for DJ Giddens, who was a 2-year starter, but he's a really explosive guy. I mean, rushed for 546 yards and 5 touchdowns last year, 7 yards per carry, and he can catch the ball out of the backfield. So you got him. They brought in a kid, Antonio Martin, a kid, 200-pound, 5'11" kid from the Southland Conference. He was Southeastern Louisiana's second leading rusher last year with 1,200 yards, 11 touchdowns. So you've got a really good running attack coming back. And then the receivers, we did talk about that. Jace Brown is back. So you got a number 1 receiver. They recruited a kid named Jaron Tibbs from Purdue, who has just been killing it through spring. I haven't heard anything yet in the fall camp, but he's a steady over the middle guy. You brought in Jerron Bradley from Boston College, and he was a pretty good receiver. I think he had close to 900 yards last year. And then you've got Caleb Medford coming over from New Mexico, and he was honorable mention All Mountain West last year. Didn't catch a lot of balls, I think like 28 balls for 400 yards, but showed some real talent out there. And then you've got tight ends galore. So you've got Garrett Oakley, who caught 22 passes for 236 yards, 5 TDs last year. You got Will Swanson back. You got Will Ansio back. And then you brought in a 5-star recruit, essentially a guy named Lincoln Cure, who's a tight end, but probably could split out and play wide receiver right now. So you've got all the elements there for a really solid offensive performance this year, taking a solid leap from what they did last year.
And I think that's one of those things about Kansas State that gets overlooked a little bit as well. As you mentioned those tight ends too, and especially when I think of shotgun pistol, a lot of the time those tight ends really get overlooked. It's something that I definitely kind of foresee them utilizing a lot more too. And I think another stat that I'll bring up too that kind of talks about this offense and something that's really just indicative of Big 12 football in general. But this stat I found really intriguing. Last year, 43% of conference games were decided by only 1 score. So I think it's really going to be pivotal that Avery Johnson continues to be he's pretty solid decision maker, especially as a sophomore last year. Granted, you can talk about a couple of the duds. For example, I particularly think of the Iowa State game last year where he went 12 for 28 and threw a couple picks. But I think that's really to be expected. And I think Chris Kleiman and the offensive staff and everybody there kind of anticipate that happening to some degree, that yes, there's going to be some growing pains, but he's certainly going to be our guy.
Yeah, he's definitely the man. They lost 4 conference games. They lost to Houston unexcusably. They lost to they lost to Arizona State. It was a national championship semifinal team. They lost to Iowa State, and I can't even remember who the other lost to, but it was a good season. They had a good season. They had a good team, and we'll talk about this year's schedule a little bit later. But it'll be interesting to see how they navigate this schedule.
Yeah, because I mean, for the most part, too, at least to me, this feels like a Kansas State team that I think a lot of fans are going to be excited about this year. And I go back and think of the days of Bill Snyder, for example, and I just think like if somebody asked me like what's the pillar of consistency and success, he's the guy that comes to mind, especially knowing that he pretty essentially did it twice because when he had his second run, I think back in 2006 and 2007, I don't quote me on that year, but that was a pretty turbulent time for that program too, because it wasn't easy to get back into that hole either.
Yeah, I mean, Bill Snyder's an icon. He took a downtrodden K-State program and completely turned it around, and literally they've been good for 25 years now between him and Kleiman, and I mean, it's amazing.
Yeah, and last thing I'll ask about the offense in particular too is what are your general thoughts about their offensive line and most importantly in terms of them offensively, how do you think Avery Johnson's going to evolve as well?
Well, they've brought in a couple of transfers, and so it's going to depend on how quickly they all mesh and gel. But they brought in this kid from Ohio State, George Fitzpatrick, and I think he's an impressive guy. And he wasn't playing full time for Ohio State, but last week he went out with an undisclosed health scare, and I think he's on the mend. But anytime you miss practice and you're trying to work out with guys, and then you got another guy, Penn State Lion, JB Nelson, Penn State Lion, JB Nelson, who also came over in the offseason. He's a 3-star. He played all 16 games last season for the Nittany Lions. And so you got two guys on the offensive line that didn't play with the other guys. And then you got just recently a guy named Terrence Enos Jr., who came from Pitt. And he just got into the portal on the 18th of April. So you've got a bunch of guys who have big school credentials, but I just don't know how much they've played together yet. And so that may be the Achilles heel for the team if they can't give Avery Johnson the protection he needs, and if they can't give or create holes for Dylan Edwards. So that's the part of I'd probably worry about most with this team right now.
Yeah, because I mean, all things considered, I definitely 100% agree with that too. Because you rattled off a lot of those weapons that they have, and it just seems, especially too when they averaged almost 31 points a game last season. So they're certainly explosive. They certainly have the weapons. It's just more or less, can Matt Wells continue to build off the momentum that they have while also trying to bring some continuity into this offensive line that is going to have a lot of transfers and just a lot of turnover in general too. When especially generally speaking, a lot of offensive lines, especially in the Power Four, are generally going to be upperclassmen. You don't really see too often. At least Power Four programs utilizing a lot of freshmen and sophomores as starters because it's just such a technical position in that way too.
Yeah, for sure.
And then it's worth mentioning too that at least defensively, we might as well shift gears here. And at least defensively, for the most part, they've been relatively consistent for the past couple seasons, according to the SP Plus ranking somewhere between top 25 to 35, which all things considered is pretty solid. But at least on my end, my biggest concern is the secondary last year, because there were a number of games last year where they definitely got a little bit burned. And, at least for me, that's definitely going to be that big question mark is, hey, number one, do they add enough pieces in the secondary for them to take some pressure off of them? And then most importantly, is the pass rush also going to develop and kind of find their own too? Because I think there's definitely a potential for them to get some more action out of that aspect too.
Yeah, I think defensive line, I think they're going to be pretty good. They've got a lot of talent. They've got a bunch of guys coming back. So, I think they'll be okay. The secondary is the real question because they lost two guys to the pros. So, they're going to be replacing guys, and they're not really sure who's going to be there. They've got a couple starters coming back, Jacob Parrish and Keenan Garber. Those two guys are the guys who left. And so you got sophomores Zasan, Rich, and Donovan McIntosh, who showed some promise, but they didn't play that much really. And so they also brought in some transfer Jaden Rowe from Oklahoma, and they brought in a kid named Amarian Fortenberry from South Alabama. So those guys are going to have to step up because they lost those two starters, Parrish and Garver. And both of them were good enough to be drafted by, I think they're in New Orleans or Houston, or one of the pro teams. I can't remember which ones right now. So that's going to be the key for them this year for sure.
Yeah, because we talked about this a little bit too, that they actually bring back a good amount of solid returning production as well, even on the defense side of the ball. I think of those linebackers, Desmond Purnell and Austin Romaine as well, who were definitely pretty significant weapons for them as well. And at least too, I think another thing that definitely is worth mentioning too, particularly about the linebacking core, is there was a little bit of a little bit of injury bug going on in that linebacking core. So it's definitely something to kind of keep our eyes on this year in terms of Kansas State. Is I think for the most part, defensive coordinator Joe Klanderman has done a really good job at shifting guys and utilizing assets as necessary. But I definitely think especially if there's an injury scare in the secondary, that can definitely be another conversation or possibly a reason why we talk about Kansas State as a 7 or 8 win team as opposed to 9 or 10, assuming everything goes right.
Yeah, I mean, having Austin Romaine back is great. He led the team in tackles, 96 total tackles, a couple sacks, 2 pass deflections, 3 forced fumbles. So he's a good kid. He's going to be a Big 12 first-team player this season. And you're right, Desmond Purnell is having a good fall camp. He's going to be back. So I think they're going to be pretty set. I mean, remember they play a 3-3-5 offense or defense, and so they're playing they're playing a defense that's designed to stop spread offenses. So they're playing nickel back essentially on defense all the time, and so really it still gets back to how good they're going to be at defensive back, and then how good will they be at safety.
Yeah, and you brought up a good point too, particularly about the secondary too. And I think this something in general that's worth mentioning about Kansas State is Kansas State's done a pretty solid job at recruiting too, especially with it being a relatively difficult place at times to kind of be able to land guys in the sense that you're really kind of selling a different vision in terms of, hey, it's really just kind of a very grassroots type of culture and not something where you're necessarily going to get some of the, I guess it's just a different feel compared to Alabama and that world versus what you get in Kansas State too. I think they had 25 guys commit, and I think they were ranked about 35 or 36 in terms of recruiting this year. So that's definitely something worthwhile too, especially when you look and you see that they, for the most part, definitely decided that they're going to stick on the defense side of the ball in terms of a lot of those guys.
Yeah, I'm always I've had the privilege of going to Manhattan, and it's the middle of nowhere, and getting kids to go there. It's like you go to Kansas and you're right there, right by a major city. Overland's right by. I mean, it's right by Kansas City. There's things to do. It's the kids want to go there. Kansas State is 2 hours from nowhere. I mean, you go through wheat fields for 2 hours and you finally get to a little tiny town that has one Holiday Inn, and yet they've managed to recruit talent there every single year, and they do a good job recruiting Kansas, which helps. They get some Oklahoma kids, they get some Texas kids, but they do a relatively good job. You're right, they were like 37th ranked class this year. 25 enrollees. I got 2 4-star kids, a kid named Noah King, who's a cornerback from Fairfield, Ohio. And then I talked about Lincoln Cure. He's a 4-star from Goodland, Kansas. So you got a couple of good players that you get. And they do all right with the transfers. They obviously have enough portal money that they're getting some decent transfers that are coming in as well. They're coming from big schools. They probably weren't playing as much as they liked at big schools, so they're coming to Kansas, and it's almost that. I don't want to say this in a bad way, but it's that next tier down. Like there's the Ohio State recruiting, and then there's Big 12 recruiting, right? It's different. And so, but they get kids to stay, and half of a football team is getting some continuity, right? And I feel the same way about basketball. The teams that can get guys to stay together for 3 or 4 years are so much better than the teams that are doing the one and done, no matter how good their players are.
Yeah, I'm definitely glad you brought up that difference too, because at least on this show, I definitely try to highlight recruiting as much as I can too, because you just see so many different types of programs, and at least I definitely try to give a shout out to those type of programs too, because if you ask me in terms of what wins you a national championship, to me it always comes back to recruiting. Even in this day and age of transfer portal, I think to myself, what's going to be the true difference? The amount of depth that you have in your team, and the continuity and the overall message and culture and all those things too.
Well, if you can get 3 and 4 star kids, which almost every Big 12 team does, by the way, right?
Yeah.
And they can coach them up and grow them up and get them in the weight room, they're fine. They can compete with the Alabamas of the world, right? But they don't initially get the same kid that Alabama team gets, right? So, but Alabama loses their kids after 2 years to the pros. So, it's all relative.
Exactly, and it cancels itself out in a way too, and especially when you look at a program like BYU, who's independent for a number of years and coming in to a Big 12, and I think just making everyone just really kind of bring their A game to knowing, especially too with the rumors about Memphis, which by the way that's a different show, but they gave Big 12 declined $250 million for Memphis to join too, so it's definitely a testament to what the overall conference is doing as well, and the level of talent that's coming in.
Yeah, I don't think the Big 12 wants Memphis, because $250 million would have split nicely among those 16 teams for the next year.
Yeah, I think they said it was like a 5-year deal, and it would have ended in 2030, and they wouldn't have had to give any revenue, but that's neither here nor there. But we talked about the defense a couple seconds ago. We talked about just the team, the program, and a little bit about the coaching staff. But let's shift gears to the schedule a little bit. And
sure.
when you look at this schedule, I mean, there's a number of intriguing games on there. Obviously, we got to start with Iowa State. That's played on August 23rd, week 0, over in Dublin. And with that said, at least to me, this feels like such a bigger game for Kansas State, in the sense that Iowa State they definitely lived up to the hype last year, and yes, they have Rocco Beck coming back and all those things too. But to me, this game feels a lot more bigger for Kansas State, in the sense that I think this really, for me, if they end up finding a way to beat Iowa State, I think that could really be the catalyst to exactly what we were talking about, as possibly a Big 12 contender. I think a game that they desperately need to show that hey, this team could be a threat.
Yeah, you kind of hate to have such a big game before you've played a game. And this is a risky proposition for both teams. They're both traveling. They both started camp already, so they're a little bit ahead of all the rest of the teams. But it's going to be a very interesting game, and it's a pick-em game. I can't imagine one team or the other being favored by more than a point or two. In that type of game, it'll be very close. The schedule isn't the worst schedule in the world. Let's say it that way. They've got the 9th hardest schedule, according to most pundits in the conference, but it's a weird schedule because they have the 0-week game against Iowa State. So you're starting right away against conference opponent. And then you come home against North Dakota, which is a pretty good FCS team.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then the next week you play against Army, who plays a different style of offense that you probably haven't done that much preparation for. And Army was a pretty good team last year. They got in the top 25 for most of the season. And then you play a non-conference game against conference opponent Arizona at Arizona. And so you kind of go, wow, that's not the easiest 4 games to start with. And then you go to UCF. And then you go at Baylor. Then you get to the killer part of the schedule, right? You go at Baylor versus TCU, Kansas, who you barely beat last year. You beat them by 2. And then you go at Texas Tech. So those 4 games right there will make or break your season probably. And then you got Oklahoma State, and then you go to Utah who's going to be greatly improved this year, and then you end up with Colorado. So, man, that can be a very interesting schedule. If they get off to a bad start, it could all go south.
Yeah, it's that, and you brought up a great point too about being a toss-up, especially with a lot of those games towards the end of the season. Which, as much as we can talk about Dublin too, and with Iowa State, it's going to be especially telling when they host Texas Tech as well, because that seems like, at least to me, it seems like definitely one of the big favorites in terms of the Big 12, and bringing in James Blanchard as their general manager, and just the overall amount of influx of dough that they have too, which I'm sure it's always nice having that oil money as well. And and I definitely want to ask you this, just as someone who covers the Big 12 and everything too. But maybe this is just a me thing as someone from the outside looking in. But I feel like I've always noticed in terms of the Big 12 that it always seems like their home and away schedules always kind of flip-flopping back and forth. You know what I mean? It never seems like that certain teams I never see too often where they have maybe a 3-game home stretch or something like that, where you see some of the other, Big Ten counterparts or the SEC, where sometimes they get 3 or 4 home games in a row, and then they maybe go on the road once or twice. I think it's something that's always worth mentioning, especially for people who may not follow the Big 12 as much either.
Yeah, they alternate every year between 5 home games and 4 road games, and 4 road games and 5, or 4 and 5, and 5 and 4. So that is that historically the teams have been close enough where people can travel and drive. That changed a couple of years ago when they added Central Florida and West Virginia and Cincinnati. But that's sort of how it's always been, and so that's been pretty typical for them you get a game or 2 at home, and then you're on the road, and that's the way it goes.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I feel like I'm learning something new every day on here too. Because it seems like for the most part that the beginning of their schedule is definitely something that they can navigate. It's just, you mentioned too, North Dakota and Army and an Arizona team that feels like that they're definitely developing too. There's so many question marks too, and it's good that we talked about Kansas State today, because I just read an article the other day about Iowa State and how they're in I think it was $147 million deficit in terms of the athletic department. Did you read about that?
Wow, I missed that one.
Yeah, so I think there's going to be some growing pains for Iowa State in general. Hopefully it doesn't impact the football program too much either.
Well, we're gonna see another round of reorganization, that, and it's starting with the ACC, and some combination of North Carolina, Florida State, and Clemson are going to leave. And the minute that happens, then what, right? Because there's a whole bunch of teams that would fit really nicely into that. They either go into the ACC, so like West Virginia, Central Florida would fit really nice into that footprint, or the other way around. The Big 12 makes a grab for Duke and some of those teams, and so it's going to be South Carolina. I mean, not South Carolina, but Duke and North Carolina State, and so we're going to see some changes here. And I could see easily the Pac-12, which has some life, maybe Cal and Stanford come back to that. So in the next 4 or 5 years, definitely there's going to be some action. And so I think we're kidding ourselves if we think the Big 12 is going to look like it does 4 years from now. And if the Big 10 and SEC get their way, they're going to have 20 teams each, and they're going to dominate all of college sports, and everyone else is going to be scrambling for a next level.
Exactly. And it just kind of seems, wrong to me in the sense that there could be a day where we don't get Kansas and Kansas State every year too, especially with, Kansas now. They're finally kind of turning it around. And I think Lance Leopold is, at least in my opinion, one of the most underrated coaches in the entire country. And Chris Kleiman definitely deserves some credit there too. So he's
a very solid coach. I expect a nice season for Kansas State. I think I would have, if I was predicting right now, I'd say this is sort of a 9-3 team, maybe 6-3 in conference. So we'll see. how it goes.
Yeah, because that's about where I have them too, about an 8 or 9 win team. I just feel like Kansas State's one of those teams where you mentioned Houston a couple of times. They always drop one of those dud games, for example. Then for the most part, they're able to navigate the rest of it at least fairly well. But because of so many conference games that they play every year anyway, then it's such a that's why the Big 12, at least for me, is one of the hardest conferences to pick, and why I'm always pretty hesitant to say, oh, this team's going to do this or this team's going to do that.
Yeah, I've seen predictions from Utah winning it, to Iowa State, Texas Tech, BYU, TCU, Kansas State. I mean, this conference is wide open this year. It's just going to be like last year. Arizona State, you're going to have 4 or 5 teams that all have sort of 6-3, 5-4 records, or 7-2. I mean, it's going to be that kind of conference again this year. It's going to be very high quality football.